I didn't see you there. I'm Tyler from Tyler's Priestcraft Barbecue. Is life tough? Do you struggle finding God in your life? Well, I'm here to help. At Tyler's Priestcraft Barbecue, we pray, we cook, and we eat meat. I invite you to come to my backyard. Bring your own meat. We'll cook it, I'll eat it, and if the Lord wants, I will give you the scraps. We can even kick back, maybe watch a chariot race or a gladiator fight on the big screen, and find peace in our lives. Thank you, and please, let's get through this together.
All right, John. I think that was pretty historically accurate.
It was.
I did my very best.
Yeah, I think so. Just to be clear, then we are starting a small business, Tyler's Backyard Barbecue. Is that it, or Tyler's Priestcraft Backyard Barbecue?
Backyard sounds a little better, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I'll
So
stick
you've
with
dedicated
backyard.
Tyler's Backyard Priestley Barbecue, or Tyler's Priestley Backyard Barbecue. Will
I'll let you
grill
do
your
the marketing.
sins so you don't have to.
There you go. It all started with you, John.
Carrying on the tradition 2,000 years later.
Great. Probably best to get back into business with this stuff rather than get too deep into my business.
Yeah, that's probably a whole nother podcast.
Last time we ended up, we just had gotten kind of to the beginning of New Testament, kind of how it was written. Shall we just pick off right where we left off?
Sure. Yeah. So, do you want me to do just a quick recap of last week's episode?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. I should have prepared this. But history is not names and dates, it's a lot more complicated. We learn it by reading it and keeping an open mind. And then we jumped into Palestine, ruled by Herod. Herod dies, 3 sons take over. And when I say ruled, I mean not really. Rome ruled it, but they let Herod kind of have control over it. Herod was very good at keeping down rebellions, which there were a lot of. His sons were not so good. There were even more rebellions with his sons. The temple, which Herod had kind of built up and made the center of every aspect of Jewish life, was the financial institution of the area. So to speak bad about the temple was to speak bad of the priests. The priests ruled the temple. It was an office that you could buy. Didn't have to be voted in or whatever. So around the time of Jesus' birth, between 4 BC to 6 AD, things were pretty rough in Judea. And yeah, is that pretty good? Anything else that I need to cover?
Yeah, we didn't get too much into the 4 AD to 6 AD time
Oh
frame.
yeah, the actual dates.
We didn't talk much about the dates, but I don't know if you plan on doing that today, or I think that's somewhat interesting.
Sure. Yeah, I could talk a little bit about it. I don't know. I know that the year 0, I think, came quite a bit after. But I can't remember who it was. Some early church leader did the math and said, okay, he was born this many years ago. We'll start the calendar then, year 0. Turned out to be inaccurate because the Bible talks about Herod the Great being alive, Herod was alive during Jesus' birth in the Bible, but this guy's date was a few years after Herod's death. So we
And that's
know that Herod the
the Great's
Great.
Herod the dad.
Yeah.
Okay.
So he was dead before the year 0. So that gives us some idea that Jesus was actually born a few years before that. Depending, there's different schools of thought on that. But
And then you said 4 to 6 AD, which would take us in the other direction. Right?
Yeah. So then there's also different thoughts on when Herod actually died and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, there's different schools of thought on it, but I think most people would assume that Jesus was born 4 years before the year 0.
Okay. Gotcha.
Most scholars, I should say.
Cool. Well, don't let me slow you up. Thanks for covering that.
Okay. All right. So I hope you're excited, Tyler, because
Is my face not showing it?
You definitely look excited, but you always look like that. I don't think I've ever seen you not excited.
It's been a while since we've stood face to face, John. I'm getting old and grumpy. Old and grumpy. The years do that to you.
Yeah. All right. We'll jump into it. So everyone knows that the biggest sources that we have on Jesus are the 4 Gospels. And the 4 Gospels, of course, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are considered the synoptic Gospels, whereas John is sort of an outlier. And the reason why they're called the synoptic Gospels is because they tend to use the same sources. Now, Mark was the earliest Gospel written around 70 CE. And that date is important. We need to remember that date, file it in the back of your mind because it's going to come back. But
Is CE the same as AD?
yes. Sorry,
Okay.
AD. CE, I guess, is the more academic approach to it, common era. But yeah, it's the same thing. So CE, the Gospel of Mark, is written down. And it's the first gospel. It's the one that most of the other gospels take from. Then comes Matthew and Luke. Matthew is probably written around 80 to 90 CE AD, and Luke a little bit after that, 80 to 110 AD. Let's talk a little bit about Mark. Oh, did you have a question?
Yeah. Do you know how we date these?
Sort of. So it's all based on context. So a lot of the information in there is based on so there's little hints throughout the Gospels, right? And scholars can go in and say, okay, so he's writing about this, but we know that this didn't happen until this time. And the other way they know is that the stuff in Mark is unique to Mark, whereas Matthew and Luke have things added. Does that make sense?
So it's mostly just based on the context, based on the words that are written. We know that they wouldn't have known about this in the year 50 AD.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So that's how they kind of know. And then so Mark traditionally is the Gospel of Mark is traditionally accredited to Mark the Evangelist, Saint Mark the Evangelist, who established the church in Alexandria. He's considered the father of Christianity in Africa. Traditionally, he's thought to be one of the 70 that Jesus sent out, and he was a traveling companion to Peter. Most scholars nowadays would agree, though, that really Mark did not write it, but that the authors wanted to have some sort of authority in the stories that they told, and so they attributed it to Mark. And it all comes from oral history that's been passed down, right? So somebody said, oh, I heard Mark talk about this, and it gets passed down until someone can finally write it down. Any questions on that?
No, not for me.
Okay. So Mark is considered to be the original gospel. Matthew and Luke take from Mark, but they also take from another source called Q. That's just what scholars call it. And Q is thought to be another original gospel. It was probably a bunch of different gospels that were written and then condensed into one and then put into Matthew and Luke. And then the Gospel of John comes much later. It doesn't take from Mark or Luke, and if or Q, and if it does, it doesn't do so to the extent that Matthew and Luke do. So that's kind of the the background on that.
So then the Q source, I'm guessing we don't have the text. We're just going based off of what Matthew and Luke say. They use the same terms, the same language as, and so we assume it's coming from a theoretical source that really comes from.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a hypothetical source. Because it comes from the idea that, well, Matthew and Luke had to be pulling from somewhere besides Mark. So there had to be another source out there somewhere. Sorry, are you getting those beeps on my computer, or is that just me?
I don't hear anything.
Okay. Sorry, hold on. Yeah, so he's a theoretical source, or Q is. And
so you're saying I could take credit and somehow pass muster?
Maybe not you, but somebody else. Yeah, theoretically.
If I was 2,000 years old, I could take credit for writing Q, because up to this point, nobody's taken credit for it yet.
Yeah, so you would have to be able to say, I wrote down this stuff that's in Matthew and Luke.
Well, I can find it there. That's no problem.
Yeah,
I'll find it there.
Yeah.
I'll do it. And change the spelling a little bit, and we're good.
Okay. Yeah, why not? But yeah, Q stands for, it's a German word meaning source. I'm not going to try to pronounce it because people are listening and they're going to be like, oh, he doesn't even know how to pronounce German. So, so yeah, Q is it's a German word for source, and it's a hypothetical source. Nobody's really sure where it comes from or what it was, but they can just derive from the fact that Matthew and Luke are talking about things that are not in Mark. So there must have been some other source out there that scholars were pulling from.
Right. And I think we talked about this last week, but you were saying that it was likely a combination of words that Saint Mark would have said, or Matthew or Mark, Luke, what things they would have said, probably combined with the voice of the person who actually put quill to parchment. Is that what they used? I'm trying to recall from 7 days ago. It's dangerous. So it's kind of includes what they would have said, but possibly more added to it.
Yeah. Like I said, it's the important thing to keep in mind is that there were scholars that had, and I use the phrase scholars because they knew how to read and write. There were scholars that had heard oral traditions from, Jesus's life, and they were able to write those traditions down. And to get people to read them, they had to have some kind of authority to do it. And so they used the names of well-known historical figures in Christianity, like Mark, Matthew, and Luke.
Okay.
And we know that Mark, Matthew, and Luke were the most accurate because they were the first ones written. Now, there's all kinds of other gospels, right? Like the Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Judas, Gospel of Mary. But those came much, much later, and they're built off of, just they're not as legit as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Luke.
Could you repeat those again? I think we had a little bit of connection issue. What were those sources you said that came later?
Yeah, so Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Judas. That one was pretty famous a few years ago. And Gospel of Mary. And there's many others too, but they all came hundreds of years later. And
Okay.
early Christians didn't really consider them to have much legitimacy to them.
When you say early Christians, this is off topic. So if it's a long answer, I can come back to it. Is that I think early Christian, I think Catholic as the ongoing authority. So is that what you're referring to with early Christian, or is it more complicated than just a Catholic authority?
Yeah, it's more complicated. There's no such thing as a Catholic in the first century. That comes
we
much,
can
much
come back
later.
to that then.
Okay. Yep. So anyway, those are the four Gospels. So those are the main sources that we have on Jesus. But there's also, Paul, he doesn't talk about Jesus's life so much, just his message. So he's not a great source. But there are two non-Christian sources that talk about Jesus, or two non-biblical sources, I should say. The first comes from a Jewish historian named Josephus, who wrote a book called Antiquities of the Jews around 93 and 94 CE, AD. Which one should we use, Tyler? Should we use AD or CE?
I want to sound smart and use CE, but I know that my ambition will catch up to me. I'll say AD. So you use whatever you want, and I'll try to keep up.
All right, we'll stick with AD because I think that's what most people are comfortable with. Okay, so in 93, 94 AD, a guy named Josephus writes the History of the Jews. And he refers to Jesus twice. And in the first section, which is called Testimonium Flavianum, which is a language for testimony of Josephus, he says, now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day. Okay, Tyler, what stands out to you in that paragraph? If you want, I can maybe throw it up on the screen so you can read through it again.
Yeah. Do we know how to do that? This is new technology. This is new technology on my end.
Yeah. Give me a second here.
So as you do that, I'll read through it because I actually do have it right here. But then you can pull it up for others to see.
Okay, can you see it?
If you zoom in, it's a little small on my screen, but there we go. That looks good. Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ, and when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again at the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day. You're asking me what looks suspect with that?
Well, just what stands out to you?
I'm going from shooting from the hip here, but I notice the term Christ. I don't know when. Well, I know Jesus used that term, but you mentioned before that the Messiah wasn't a Christ, but he's not called Messiah here. But I noticed that term, as well as Christians. I don't see anything talking about the son. Oh, I was gonna say I don't see anything talking about deity or Son of God. But well,
what's Josephus's tone? Does he sound like he's a believer?
He sounds positive to me.
Yeah, he does. But there's one phrase in there.
If it be lawful to call him a man?
A little bit. It's towards the bottom where he says, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him.
All right, you're going to have to help me with that. What's wrong with that phrase?
Yeah, he's being sarcastic.
Okay.
So Josephus, so we had
sarcasm.
Nonsense, Tyler. You're great at sarcasm.
Oh, thanks, John. Appreciate that.
So Josephus was a Jew and would not have referred to Jesus as the Christ. Now, that was an interesting catch that you made. He does refer to Jesus as the Christ, and that's because the translation comes from Greek. So this was written down in Greek. The Greek word Christ is Christ is Greek for the anointed one, which is also the Messiah. So Christ equals Messiah in this case. So he's being sarcastic when he says, let's see, pull it up again. When he says he was the Christ, he was being sarcastic, or at least he was saying this is what people thought about him. Now, the other part is that Josephus appeared in the works of a Christian apologist in the 4th century. So that implies that this is most likely partly true with some additions. Then there's a second reference that Josephus has, and it reads, Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. So he assembled the Sanhedrim of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James. So here he's talking about a high priest named Festus. So, but he's also talking about James, the brother of Jesus. Again, you can see who was called Christ. There's kind of that little tongue-in-cheek thing there, just referring to the Jews who didn't know any better and who followed this Messiah that tried to overthrow the Sanhedrin and Rome, but instead was crucified, and nothing came of it, is kind of what he's saying. He does kind of say, and this part may have been added later in the first section, where he says Christians are not extinct at this day. You may be giving him a little bit of credit there, but that also could have been added later.
Okay. So why do we care what Josephus had to say about this?
Great question.
And maybe you're getting there.
No, it's a good question. So we care because it's more evidence that there actually was a person named Jesus. Okay. And it tells us what people thought about him who weren't his followers.
Gotcha.
So yeah, even now there's debate among some people whether or not there was actually a person named Jesus who went around Palestine preaching a message. But here we have some proof that's not designed to be apologetic and doesn't really have any agenda in terms of proving whether Jesus was a divine being or not. He's just mentioning him in a history. He's being an objective historian. So that's why it's important. We have an outside perspective, and we have an outside source that there really was a person named Jesus.
Okay, I'm following now. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so the second source comes a little bit later, and it's from a Roman senator and historian named Tacitus. And he's writing about Nero. Do you know anything about Nero? Oops, sorry.
He was a conqueror, right? Or some
He
sort
was-
of bad.
Yeah,
Wasn't
he was
a bad dude.
Yeah, he was he was really, really hard on Christians. He was a Roman
Okay.
emperor. When Rome caught fire, he blamed the Christians for it. And some say he set fire to Rome himself so that he could have a reason to kill Christians. So this is what Tacitus says. Nero fastened the guilt. Actually, let me do this because it's kind of a long section and people might want to see the whole thing. So let me share it again.
Okay.
Bear with me one second.
While you pull that up, if you can multitask, we do have a question.
Yeah.
Can you define what it means to be apologetic?
Yes. So apologetic at the very base of it means to be means to have an agenda to defend a certain belief or ideal or organization, just to defend something. So you're writing to defend something. And apologetics can be great because it helps people kind of have a basis for believing what they want to believe, but also it's not necessarily objective in how it does history. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So in this case, you were talking about these. I mean, the New Testament is a great example. That's intended to be apologetic, to
Yep.
be a witness of Jesus Christ as the divine being. However, these other ones are not intended to be apologetic. I mean, they're just talking about Jesus, not to convert, not to persuade, but possibly even maybe the opposite if I get this sarcasm properly. The intent meant there. So
yeah.
Well, thanks for that question, Alex. Appreciate it. And hello, good to hear from you.
Yeah, good to know we have a listener out there.
You want me to pull up this quote?
Yeah, I'll stop sharing and you can do it.
You got it. Oh no, you.
No, I thought you had it.
I had yours up.
All right. Well, let me pull it up again real quick. Sorry, I thought you were doing it. Okay. All right. So here's the big long quote from Tacitus. It's mostly about Nero, but we'll just read this highlighted part. Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, and most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. Okay, so there's the mention of Jesus there. He's using the Latin term to describe Jesus. Okay. So that's the second non-biblical source that we have on Jesus. And right here, Tacitus is talking about the great Roman fire that Nero blamed on Christians. And if you read through that account, it's pretty brutal. There, apparently, this is what he said. Nero used Christians to light the streets at night. So, implying that
burned them.
Yeah, they were burning in the street.
Wow.
So yeah, Nero's pretty demented. But anyway, so those are our two non-biblical sources, and they're important because they give us an idea of what the world of Jesus looked like, what people thought of him. All the other, we have to rely on other sources that talk about the world of Jesus, and then paint a picture from there to kind of get an idea of what kind of person he was, his background, what life was like for him. Again, last week we talked about history kind of being a puzzle, and you have to put the pieces together without the picture. That's what we're doing now with Jesus. All we have is the Bible, which has been, added on to and taken away from for thousands of years, and then these two sources, and that's it. Everything else has to come from archaeological evidence and context.
So you're saying there's not a whole lot?
Not a whole lot, yeah.
Okay.
All right, so
Good.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say it's good segue into, well, what do we know then? Is that where you're headed with this?
Yeah, it is. All right, so again, yeah, so we talked about when he was born. Now the story of Jesus's birth, we just celebrated Christmas, and let's get into that a little bit. So we go to Luke 2, right? How does Luke 2 begin? Do you remember, Tyler?
With the taxes?
Yeah. So it came in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. Okay. Tyler, I want you to imagine yourself as Caesar Augustus.
I would need to know who that is first. I know.
So he's
we talked Palestine. We talked Galilee, Jerusalem. Where does Caesar rule? He's over Rome, the whole Rome.
Yes. So Caesar is the Roman emperor. He came after Julius Caesar. So Julius Caesar is the first emperor, right? And after he dies, there's sort of a battle for power between his nephew, Octavian, and another guy named Mark Antony. And Octavian wins, becomes the emperor. He rules from, I think, like 60 BC to like 1480, I think, something like that. So he's the emperor at the time that Jesus is born. Is that enough?
So is he Herod's boss?
Yes.
He's Herod's boss. Got it.
He's Herod's boss. Yep.
So what was your original question?
So imagine that you are Caesar. Okay.
Emperor of Rome in
you're
80.
You're basically the emperor of the world, right? Greatest empire in the world at the time. You can do whatever you want.
World, or are you saying world?
Yeah, the Western world.
Okay.
Eastern world didn't really. No, in the context that we're talking about, nobody really knows what's going on over there.
All right, so they think they're the center of the world, and
exactly. Yep.
Gotcha.
So you are the ruler of the world in your own mind. Now imagine I'm one of your assistants. You're one of your counselors. And I come up to you and I say, Emperor, we should tax the empire. What's your thoughts?
More money.
Yeah. Do you think that's a good idea?
Yeah.
Don't overthink it.
Okay, more money, of course. Let's tax them.
Okay.
That we
Okay,
take good care of them. We should get our share of the empire.
yeah,
I
of
feel like
revenue.
I'm talking
Yeah,
Star Wars. I feel like I'm talking Star Wars anytime I say empire. I'm not a
that's
historian.
that's okay. If that helps you, go ahead and think of it in those terms.
All right.
Okay,
If I was
so
Darth Vader, I would tax every person I could in the empire.
very good. But how do you know how much tax you need or that you deserve? You need to know how many people are out there, right? So, Emperor, we should do a census. Does that sound like a good idea?
That one I can follow. Yes.
Okay, let's do a census. But to do it, we should have everybody go back to their place of birth and count them there.
This is pre-airplane, pre-cars.
Yeah,
That
yeah,
one
they'd
I
have to
don't-
walk
that
a
one I don't-
ways.
That one I don't understand.
But
I
that
don't
way
need
they
count
can go
them where
back.
they
Yeah. Well, because they need to go back to where they were born. And we could go on like that. But you see my point, right? Like it just
Are you saying I passed the emperor test? Would I make a good emperor of Rome?
you'd be better than Augustus. I'll say that.
Oh boy. I wish I knew what that meant.
So yeah, so basically in Luke 2, it's saying that Augustus put out a decree that everyone in the Roman Empire should be taxed. Okay. They should be counted. Okay. Still a little unreasonable. That would take decades. But they should be counted in the place where they were born. That's just insane, right? You'd have to bring the entire economy to a halt so that everyone could get up and move back to where they were born. So it doesn't make that part of the story doesn't make a lot of sense. Does it?
No. Most things in history don't make sense to me though. So no, it does not make sense to tell everyone to go back to where they were born so I could just count them. Because it doesn't make any difference to in my opinion, it doesn't make any difference to the final number or how much they're making or what I should tax them, whether they're living wherever they're living now. That's what I want to know.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't matter whether they were born. It shouldn't anyway.
But
So
let me be clear.
So
I'm not here to second guess players in history, but that's just what I think I would do.
good point. Yeah, we want to be sympathetic. If that's what they did, then that's what they did. The truth of it though is that there's no evidence that Augustus put out a decree for everyone in the empire to move back to their place of birth to be counted and taxed. Now, there is record of a census in Judea, but that was just in Judea was like a district of Palestine, right? And that would have been fairly easy to do, but there's no record of a census at that time going on in Galilee, where Joseph and Mary were. So that part of the story, historically and logistically speaking, is kind of suspect. Not saying there wasn't traveling, that Jesus's mother and Joseph didn't actually do that, but it is a little suspect. So the question becomes then, why would Luke put all that stuff about Bethlehem in there? Because Luke is writing at a time, or he's telling the story at a time, when people would have known that this census never happened. So why would he put that in there, do you think?
You're asking why would Luke put the story of Mary and Joseph traveling to Bethlehem to be taxed if this, or for a census, if this never existed?
Yeah. Why even mention Bethlehem?
Is it part of the Messiah? What the Messiah is gonna be from the earlier prophecies?
Yeah, very good, Tyler. That's very good. Yeah,
nailed it.
Luke and the gospel writers are trying to make Jesus the Messiah for everyone. They've got a lot of boxes to check. And there were prophecies out there that the Messiah would come from the city of David. And so, okay, well, let's say that he was born there. Check. Now to us, that sounds super suspect, right? We could say, well, it didn't happen, so I'm not going to give that any credence, right? But we have to put ourselves into the shoes of the positions of people living in the first century, which is extremely hard to do. To them, history, as we know it, didn't exist. You know what I mean? It's more about just checking the boxes. It's hard to kind of wrap your head around it, and I have a hard time with it too. But to them, if someone with authority said that happened, then that's good enough. We can move on, and Jesus checks the box.
So this kind of comes back to Alex's question about apologetics. These writers were starting with the assumption, just to put just assumption of the Messiah coming, and that Jesus was the Messiah. And if that was the case, then that means that all the boxes would need to be checked. So they went back and made sure that all the boxes were checked, because there's no other way that it could have happened other than if Mary and Joseph traveled to Bethlehem and everything else. So it's almost an apologetic approach, in the sense that it's not founded by the evidence, but it's founded by this is what needs to happen because it's all true. Is that where you're going?
Yep. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think that's a helpful way to think about it. So again, we don't want to say that Joseph and Mary didn't travel to Bethlehem and Jesus wasn't born there. But it's just it would have been very hard to do, and the justification for it just isn't there.
Yeah, 2,000 years later, we don't have the documents that say, "Hey, this happened."
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep. So then the next part of Jesus's birth is the what traditional Christians call massacre of the innocents, which is when Herod found out that there was a Messiah being born. What did he do? He puts out this order to kill all the children in Bethlehem. You're familiar with the story, right, Tyler?
At the highest levels, yeah.
Yeah.
The Passover. No, not the Passover. The one that I always confused with the Passover.
No, but that's. I'm glad.
I recall a connection in my teachings once upon a time where they were connected somehow, but I don't know. This is a long time ago.
Yeah, you're getting there. So the Passover is during the time of Moses, right? During the 7 plagues of Egypt, the Lord causes all these plagues so that Egypt will let the Hebrews go, and Egypt finally lets the Hebrews go after Passover, which is when he sends the destroying angel to kill all the firstborns in Egypt, right? Then when Jesus is born, according to the story, the tradition, Herod does the same thing. He puts out an order that all of the young boys 2 years and younger should be killed. Okay, and so you see the parallel there. We'll get to that. But that massacre is only found in the Gospel of Matthew, and most scholars kind of consider that to be a legend, which that's kind of a relief. Am I right?
From the human rights perspective, yes. I don't want kids to be little babies to be killed when they're not just because even when they're not the target of all the genocide.
Exactly. Yeah. So again, going back to the parallel between Moses's Passover and Jesus's birth, what does that do? If there's a similarity there, what does that do for early Christians? Jews who are looking to follow Christ? What does that story do for them?
Well, it certainly sparks emotion and sparks a distrust for Gentiles.
Well, what it does is it connects Jesus' story to Moses' story. And
That
gives,
too.
yeah, it gives Jesus the same kind of authority that Moses had. And when you repeat these kinds of stories, it's like, oh, that's great. We do it ourselves. Like in politics, for example, we think about the best presidents have always come from nothing, right? We tend to venerate people who have come from nothing, and not so much people who have come from wealth. And so it's sort of the same thing. Like if you have a parallel to the story, then these early Christian believers are going to be more likely to accept Jesus as the Messiah. Are you following me?
Yes. I would answer these questions a lot better if you gave me the answers beforehand. I'm just throwing it out there. You could make me look pretty smart if you just sent me a list of answers with these questions you're going to ask.
Nope. Okay, moving on.
Fair enough.
Okay, so
gotta look the smart one here. I got you.
All right, so the Gospels say that Jesus was from Nazareth. So again, adding another piece to the puzzle. What did Nazareth look like at the time of Jesus' birth? Well, Nazareth was a small backwater town. Not a lot going on there. Not many people paid attention to it. There was no wealth there at all. Most people who lived there were farmers. Let's see, pulling up my map. Nazareth. Right by Galilee. Did you see it?
Yes.
Okay. So it's quite a ways away from Jerusalem. And there was a larger city kind of close by called Sepphoris. I probably mispronounced that, but that was sort of the capital of the area. A lot of wealth there. So it's very likely that Jesus would have traveled there and kind of seen what was going on in that culture. But so like I said, Nazareth is this backwater town, mostly farmers. But we also know that Joseph, Jesus' father, and therefore Jesus, were carpenters. And the word that they use in Greek is takton, which means woodworker or builder. Now, because he's not a farmer, and because there's not a lot of wood around Nazareth, Jesus would have been the lowest class of peasant, very poor. In fact, he would have traveled to Sepphoris to do work, probably. So we have to keep that in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is that the literacy rate in Palestine at this time is extremely low. 97% of Palestine couldn't read or write. So this is an interesting debate, because we know in the Gospels, in Luke, Jesus goes to the synagogue and reads. So that would have been extremely unusual. All logic says that Jesus wouldn't have been able to write or read. There was more reading than writing going on, by the way. More people could read than they could write. But so for him to go into the synagogue and be able to read would have been really, really surprising. And that's why there's a section in Mark when he does go in to the synagogue and reads. And they actually don't use the word read, but they use the word teach. So he goes into the synagogue and teaches, and the people there are astounded that this guy from their neck of the woods is able to teach to the level that he is. I think it's the part where They say, "Isn't this Mary's son? How does he know all this stuff?" And it's so unbelievable to them that Jesus actually doesn't have a lot of success in Nazareth. But
so that didn't impress them to the point where they believed more. It kind of turned them off to the idea just because he shouldn't be able to know that much.
yeah, so that's the theory, right? Like
Okay.
he must be making it up if he's this good, because there's no way he knows how to read. But the Gospel of Luke says that he did know how to read, which brings up the question, where did Jesus learn how to read? And who is the person that taught him? Because that person is an extremely important person in the history of the world. So anyway, moving on. We don't know how Jesus learned how to read, but the evidence says that he must have learned somewhere, or at least Luke says that. The other thing to keep in mind is that as Jesus is moving around, he comes to be known as a rabbi. Now, that term rabbi changes over the centuries. When we think of a rabbi now, we think of someone who is authorized to perform Jewish rituals, who's very learned in Jewish traditions and the religion, in their scriptures. But back then, rabbi didn't necessarily have that connotation. It could mean more of like just a really good teacher. And you didn't have to read to be a really good teacher. So we know Jesus is moving around. He probably knows how to read, but maybe not. And he's a very good teacher. We also know that he was a follower of John the Baptist, at least early on. Now, John the Baptist is an interesting person because he comes from a pretty well-off background. If you think about it, his father, Zacharias, was one of the temple priests. So his family would have been pretty well off. But again, the Gospels say that John the Baptist moved around in the wilderness, gathering people together and preaching. And some may have even considered him to be a Messiah. And so the theory is that Jesus was one of his early followers and took a lot of his ideas from John the Baptist and then took it one step further.
Okay. John, we're starting to run short on time. There was a question that came in through after we aired last week about Jesus that I wanted to address, just to make sure we're addressing everybody's questions that come up. She asks, and I don't have it up, so I'm going off memory. I apologize if I worded it a little bit differently, but she basically asked, why don't people talk about whether or not Jesus was a redhead? And I may have it here. I don't have it up, but she was getting at why don't people really talk much about Jesus being a redhead or not being a redhead, I guess. And I know she sent you the question, so you probably could maybe read the question if you have it and then address it.
Yeah, she actually didn't send it to me, but I'll pull it up.
Oh, okay. I do have it. Great first episode. Why does no one ever talk about the possibility of Jesus as a redhead? There we go. Thanks
because no one wants. Yeah, no one wants Jesus to be a redhead. That's why. No, I don't know. Apparently, it's possible that Hebrews in the first century did have red hair, but most historians think that Jesus looked something like this. Let me see if I can pull it up here. Bear with me one moment. We're going to go super professional here. Nope, that didn't work.
This is our professional episode. I think it sounds like our connection's been pretty unstable throughout this podcast. So I apologize if I'll go back and listen and see if it's cutting out, and we'll do our best to fix this moving forward.
Yeah. Yeah, that's no good. Definitely want to have a good connection. Okay. This right here. Can you see it, Tyler?
Yeah, we can see it well.
So quite a bit different than what we're used to traditionally. But men of Palestine were typically shorter guys, darker skin, short beards, short hair. Yeah, not so much the white, reddish hair, blue eyes that we're used to. So
Okay.
that's probably more along the lines of what he looked like.
And we did get one other comment I wanted to share. I don't particularly read a question this, but you may want to address it. I've read that the whole census thing could be interpreted that they went to Bethlehem to fulfill prophecy and registered themselves as citizens, but those records were probably later destroyed by Rome. Is that something you'd like to address? I
mean, it's possible. Yeah, it's possible. We'd have to figure out why, or if there's evidence of Rome destroying census records. But there's still the logistical thing of it, of asking people to uproot themselves and travel sometimes hundreds of miles without a reliable means of transportation on unsafe roads, just to be counted and taxed. But yeah, again, it's definitely possible, but I'd be very skeptical if it was done to the scale that Luke says it was done at.
Okay, cool, thanks. Well, I was expecting to get a little bit more into Jesus as far as kind of the life of Jesus. Do you want to give us a teaser for what we'll cover next week, as far as content?
Yeah, so we're covering a lot of ground, and this is, I should clarify, we want it to be a podcast on LDS church history, but we'll get there. Right now we're just kind of laying a groundwork for what Jesus looked like, not physically, but what he was.
And physically, and then, you can show us a picture.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Yes.
So, watch us on YouTube if you see that picture.
So we're laying a groundwork for the historical Jesus, how he was viewed throughout the centuries up to the time of Joseph Smith, where Joseph Smith's concept of Jesus comes from, and then we'll go from there. But yeah, next week we'll talk about more about sort of the life of Jesus, stories from his life, and the resurrection, the crucifixion and resurrection, church organizations, what the church looked like in the early days. So tune in next week.
So next week we'll wrap up the Jesus time frame, and then likely the week after that we'll jump in with Joseph Smith, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure, we could do that. We're just flying by the seat of our pants on this podcast.
Exactly. So, all right. So that, if you're wondering, you said this was a podcast about LDS church history. Why aren't we talking about it? We are getting there. And, but like John said, this framework is important to understand. I find it really interesting as well. So thanks, John.
Good.
I appreciate it.
Thank you. Always a pleasure, Tyler.
Yeah. Last time we ended, we kind of just said, hey, folks, if you like this podcast, please do whatever you do for good podcasts, high ratings, subscribe, whatever. I've come to realize that I have no idea what our ratings are across any of the almost all the platforms where we can be found. So please do that. But more specifically, if you want us to recognize it, please subscribe to YouTube. I can see who's subscribing to YouTube, and then that's just something for as a podcaster. It's pretty easy for me to keep track of. So if you want to say thank you, if you want to let us know you appreciate it, and you listen to it anywhere else or on YouTube, please just subscribe to this on YouTube, and then that'll kind of help us recognize it and see it. Send us an email, get on our website. That's really, I think, the most transparent from my end of what I'm going to see. So,
yes, and if you want your sins grilled away, send Tyler some meat.
Send me some meat. I will cook it and eat it. It'll be delicious. Cool. Well, we'll be all. Thanks for joining. We will see you all next week. Again, 7 o'clock Mountain Time, 9 o'clock Eastern Time.
Okay.
Anything else, John?
Nope, that's it.
All right. Well, it's an hour.
Yeah.
It's an hour past my bedtime, so I'm gonna get ready for bed. But life's rough, and roll on. I don't know if I'm ever gonna play this without laughing.
It's so good.